Hello and welcome to the first episode of Clearing Confusion. I am NecroVMX and my aim is so that you leave this video less confused than you came into it. Our first episode is, what exactly are bits and do they matter? If you're one of my younger viewers, you may wonder just what the hell this whole thing with bits even is. You may have heard terms such as 8-bit, 16-bit, 32-bit, but rarely is an indication of meaning ever given, only vague notions that in video gaming, bits can connotate raw power, faster speeds, more colors, sharper graphics, and overall better games. If you're around my age or older, you might be even more confused as the hierarchy of bits gets confused by reality, and you might have wondered if the entire thing is nothing more than a bullshit marketing term made to sell you the latest consoles, just like Sega's blast processing. It seems there was a time when all anybody talked about was bits, and all gamers understood that the more bits you had, the better the games looked. The first time I heard anybody ever talking about bits was when the TurboGrafx-16 was released. It was a home console that contained graphics far beyond what the NES was capable of. The 16 in the title stood for 16-bit. Well, we wondered what the hell does that mean, and NEC let us know simply that the NES was 8 bits and the TurboGrafx-16 was 16 bits. By simple mathematical logic, you could simply infer that the TurboGrafx-16 was twice as good as the NES. Later on, the Sega Genesis came out and displayed the word 16-bit right on the console, and the games looked as good as, if not better than, the TurboGrafx-16. Nintendo's NES couldn't compete with these more advanced games, and they released their own 16-bit console, the Super NES. After that, it was like a race to the top. Most gamers refer to this as the 16-bit era, when the Super NES and Genesis were the kings of gaming, and in the future you would see 32-bit systems, 64-bit systems, and then people just stopped talking about bits. After the Nintendo 64, which was 64-bit obviously, people assumed the next leap would be 128-bit systems, since it always seemed to be double the previous. And when Sega's Dreamcast came out, a lot of people were calling it a 128-bit system. But it was really only the fans. Sega rarely used 128-bit in their marketing. Same with Sony's PlayStation 2. And you never heard it from Microsoft's Xbox or Nintendo's GameCube or after that. It seemed the word bit had passed from the lexicon of video game marketing and no one talked about bits at all anymore. So really, what I call the bit era lasted from 1987 when the TurboGrafx-16 came out to sometime around 1999 when people stopped making weird assumptions about how many bits that just the Sega Dreamcast has. So, what are bits, and do they even matter at all? I get questions about this all the time, but it seems odd to me that people can't figure it out. They must be confused. So, I'm here to clear up the confusion. One of the most common questions I get is about the Game Boy Color. Everybody knows that Game Boy Color is an 8-bit console, but people wonder why the graphics look better than the NES, which was also an 8-bit console. Nobody ever really talked about bits in the pre-NES era, but for the most part, systems made by Atari and such were 8-bit systems. And when I refer to, say, the Atari 2600 as being an 8-bit system, people get confused. How can that be 8-bit? It looks so primitive compared to the NES. This is because people really don't know what bits are, other than what marketing departments have taught them to think. People think of 8-bit as being the NES, 16-bit as being the Super NES or Genesis, 32-bit as being the PlayStation or Saturn, and 64-bit as being the Nintendo 64. But beyond that, it gets hazy. So first, let me tell you straight off the bat. The amount of bits a system boasts has very little to do with the graphical power or speed of the system. Here's some food for thought. You may be familiar with the Intellivision. In case you weren't, it came out in 1980, although it was released to test markets in 1979, and graphics-wise it was comparable to the Atari 5200 or the ColecoVision. As a matter of fact, the Intellivision and ColecoVision were so similar in name, design, graphics, and game libraries that a lot of people confused the two. But here's where it gets interesting. The The ColecoVision was an 8-bit system, and the Intellivision was a 16-bit system. Here's another thing to blow your mind. There has never been a video game system with bits bigger than 64. That's right, 64 is the highest it goes as far as video game consoles go. It's weird enough to point out the disparity between the Atari Jaguar and the Nintendo 64 in terms of graphical quality, but just think of this. The most advanced system on the market right now is the PlayStation 3. The PlayStation 3 uses Cell processors, which are 32-bit. So this should, right there, destroy your perception that more bits means more power. After all, you surely can't say that the Nintendo 64, or much worse, the Atari Jaguar, are twice as powerful as the PlayStation 3. That would just be silly. So bits apparently don't matter, but what are they anyway, and why did they once seem so important? The word bit is a contraction. It's short for binary digit. It's one of the most basic units of information used in computers. To understand how bits work, you have to understand binary. Binary is the system by which almost all computers run. Bi means two, and really all computers only know two things. These two things are abstracts, which basically mean on and off, and are represented usually by the numbers 0 and 1, although it could be anything. All information processed and stored by computers can be broken down to alphanumeric text, and all alphanumeric text can be broken down to single characters, which in turn can be broken down into binary codes. Binary is universal. Although zeros and ones are the most common form of this, they're just a representation of the abstracts involved. It's just two different states. All alphanumeric characters that can be input to computers are represented by a string of 8 bits, which is called a byte. In binary, the byte, and remember that's 8 bits, is a string of 8 zeros and ones. For example, the binary byte for a capital A is 01000001. For a lowercase a, it's 01100001. Computers use processors, which processes the information generated by input from devices such as keyboards, mice, and controllers, or things such as software, operating systems, and programs. Everything to do with computers, from MP3 files to games to pictures of tits to computer viruses, are made of information, and the information is made of bits. Processors have things called registers, which are basically small bits of storage that can be accessed by the processor at insanely high speeds. Processors access information from all over your computer, but some can be accessed faster than others. The slowest source are tape backups. Faster than that are hard drives, and then flash memory or USB, and then RAM, and then your processor's cache. The fastest of all are the processor registers, because they are part of the processor itself. The amount of information stored on registers is very small and constantly changing. The registers are measured by the amount of information they can hold, and the basic unit of information is bits. So for example, a processor which has registers that hold 8 bits of information each is an 8-bit processor. The amount of information that can be held by a processor's registers is referred to as the word size, or alternatively, word length or word width. Increasing the word size gives the processor access to larger registers and allows it to process more information at that faster speed. This doesn't mean that the processor itself is faster, but it means that it is more efficient. For example, a 16-bit processor can't access your hard drive any faster than an 8-bit processor. But when processing information through the registers, the 16-bit processor has more storage for fast access. This information is generally used for the fastest things the processor has to do, the most minute and small functions which must be done quickly, such as math functions. Now remember when I mentioned there were no video game systems that used 128-bit processors? Well, there really aren't any computers at all that you could buy that use them. Like I said, the registers are used for small functions such as math, so 128-bit registers, which are insanely expensive by the way, are used for tools that require either a great deal of mathematics to be processed at high speeds, such as the symmetric ciphers used in cryptography, or instances where an insane degree of precision is needed, such as the storage of incredibly large numbers. If you also remember, I called the PlayStation 3 32-bit. You might wonder, if 64-bit processors are out there, and are generally speaking more efficient than 32-bit processors, why would the most advanced gaming console on the market use 32 bits? Simply because increasing the word size of a register beyond 32-bit does not really mean anything when it comes to things such as rendering high-resolution graphics and creating virtual 3D spaces. Although 64-bit processors are becoming more and more common in home PCs, in video games they generally prefer to load up a console with multiple 32-bit processors, such as the cell processors found in a PlayStation 3, than to use 64-bit processors. And this goes down to another very simple factor, cost. Registers are expensive, and cost goes up quite a lot with word width. It's simply more cost-effective to use more of the cheaper 32-bit processors than to deal with those very expensive 64-bit processors. In the world of PCs, cost isn't as much of an issue because computers do a lot more than video game consoles, get used more often, and users keep them longer. So spending upwards of $1,000 on a new computer is a much better investment than spending that amount on a game console. In today's society, computers are practically mandatory and video games are hobbies. So that being said, you might be wondering again about that Atari Jaguar. Did that thing have 64 bits for real? I mean, that was the entire marketing campaign. Do the math. 64 is bigger than 16. Holy shit, buy this piece of shit now. Well, there were 3 processors in the Jaguar, and one of them had a 64-bit object processor and a 64-bit blitter, which is a coprocessor. The CPU was basically made up out of several processors, some of which were 64-bit and some of which were 32-bit. By comparison, the Nintendo 64 used a fully 64-bit CPU. One thing I've always found amusing was that back in the day, Sega tried to claim that the Genesis, or Mega Drive as it was called outside the US, was the first true 16-bit system, as the TurboGrafx-16 used dual 8-bit processors. This is funny to me because using multiple processors at a lower word size rather than using one at a larger word size is today considered more efficient and is the norm. Now, the other day I saw an ad for a computer that had dual quad-core processors, meaning there were 2 processors, both of which had 4 processing cores within. It's generally speaking the way to go to load up your computer with as many processors as possible rather than just trying to get the fastest one. I mean, speaking of computers, in the 90s, it seemed every few weeks a faster processor came out. But for the most part, they seem to top out at around 3.2 gigahertz, unless you're into overclocking, of course. Creating computers that operate quicker seems to be less these days about faster processors and more about efficiency. If you have one single 2.3 gigahertz processor, it can only use those 2.3 gigahertz on one function at a time. Having several slower ones all working at once, much more efficient. So yeah, having 2 8-bit processors in the TurboGrafx, kinda ahead of its time. Plus Sega conveniently forgot about the 16-bit Intellivision. Which brings me to the whole point about marketing in video games. The original question might be, if the Intellivision was 16-bit, how come it looked the same as the 8-bit ColecoVision? But understanding all that I've explained changes the question. Now you have to wonder why it became such a huge marketing term when it clearly doesn't matter. Well, Mattel Electronics, who made the Intellivision, had no reason to market the system as 16-bit, because people would say, who cares? The ColecoVision looks the same, so what does 16-bit mean to me as a consumer? But when the TurboGrafx and the Genesis were around, they weren't competing with equal systems, but with the NES, which dominating the gaming landscape since its release. Surely showing the games look better gets people's attention, but saying 16-bit creates a buzzword, so it's like, damn, look at those graphics. Yeah, they're 16-bit, and NES is only 8. Of course, it's an over-reliance on this that caused it to stop. When Atari started their Do the Math campaign, well, it didn't add up. See what I did there? Well, it was easy to say, yeah, 16 bits looks twice as good as 8 bits. We didn't extend that to believing that 64 bits was 4 times as good as 16, when Jaguar games looked barely more advanced than the Super NES games. Of course, the Jaguar was notoriously difficult to develop for, and we never really found out what its true potential was. Could it possibly have shown graphics that would have matched something like, say, Super Mario 64? We'll never know, really, but it's something to think about. Which brings me back to the Dreamcast. Was it 128-bit? Well, the reason a lot of people seem to think so is that it had a 128-bit vector graphics engine, which actually has a lot more to do with the game's graphics than the word size of the processor. The actual processor of the Dreamcast was the Hitachi SH4, which has both 32-bit and 64-bit registers. Like I said, 128-bit word size is something insanely expensive and rare, and isn't used in commercially available computers, so after this console, manufacturers relied on 32-bit and 64-bit processors. There was no reason to use this in marketing, as it would seem like an illogical step backwards. And the PlayStation 2? While Sega was very rarely using the term 128-bit, you can definitely say that Sony used it a bit more often. Well, the processor of the PlayStation 2 was the Sony Emotion Engine, which has registers that range from 16-bit to 64-bit. The total word size of all the registers combine to 128 bits, but there are no 128-bit registers on the Emotion Engine. So now you know what bits are, and you know what they mean in the overall landscape of gaming, and you know that they don't matter as much as what you once thought they did. Well, that was a lot more in-depth than you probably figured, huh? Well, next week we'll take a look at something a lot simpler, though it probably has caused more confusion than bits ever could. Final Fantasy. Yeah, you might say I've covered it already in my history of Final Fantasy, but I'm going to go more in depth about the oddball numbering of the series and hopefully get it out there to a larger audience. See you then.